the demand side is wanting to switch, but when we look at their capability to adapt or adopt technology applications, we find that it's still, we can say, crude. There is a long way to go for them, and there are reasons why that might be the case. So I want to review some of these things. This is based on surveys we did in May and June on the use of different technology applications. But I mean, the first finding we see, this is, we did a survey in 2006 also to get a sense of how immigrants were dealing, for example, with the use of internet-based applications. And there we learned that only 30% of immigrants use the internet. At that time, 60% of Americans were using the internet. Now we see that it's 41% of immigrants who use the internet, but the average American basically is about 78%. There is still a significant disconnect. Immigrants are growing, increasingly using the internet, but still, compared to the rest of the US population, still half of that number. So we looked at different methods, and we basically find a couple of things. Basically that there are three groups of people connected to technology applications, whether it's the internet, mobile phones, or the role of car-based transfers. You have a user, basically half of users who basically do not rely on technology applications. And then we find a basic user, someone who uses occasionally or at some point some of these devices, and then 15% of people who are the active users. So, for example, on the internet, we find that 41% of people use the internet, but half of them use basically for emails. And the percent of people who use it for e-commerce, for example, is relatively slow, is less than 3% of the total group. The interesting aspect is that even that 45% that uses these systems faces that their frequency is relatively low. It's almost like a U-shaped curve. You either have a group that is very active or a group that is completely inactive, that doesn't use it at all. So you don't have really a mainstream group of users. An average you can call number of people who use the internet, but you either have people who don't or people who do. On social networking things, basically 60% of people do not use any social network. About 40% of them use Facebook. But again, the frequency is relatively limited. It's really small. When we look at the issue of mobile applications, we find that, yes, 90% of immigrants have cell phones, and that 51% uses the other applications such as texting, for example. Then others use the mobile for photos, 22% only, and the reason is that their mobile device doesn't allow that function. That is that the average immigrant really have a more basic cell phone device. And therefore, their ability to use a more advanced system like MP3 players or photos is really limited or low. And again, the use, even among those who practice that activity of using MP3s or listening to music or using it for other activities, is very small. The regular active practice is really limited. It's restricted to a few. But at the same time, those who are more active users are also the ones who are willing to change and try new technologies. So we see that there is some core group, a critical mass, but relatively small. On the card issue, we find something very interesting. The number of people using debit cards has increased substantially, and the use of credit card users has dropped. This makes sense in a time of recession where people, especially with immigrants, who face substantive constraints with regards to their finances. Immigrants typically save an average of $4,000. Their stock of savings is about $4,000. And with the recession, this amount had been dropping since 2007 to about 3,000 or less. And they have had to find alternatives to deal with their loss of income. At least 1/3 of immigrants lost their income by at least 20%, especially not only those working in the construction industry, but also in other activities related to construction. And then you have that 12% lost their jobs. So maybe that might explain why people had decided to switch to debit cards. It might also explain that people are cautious, that they don't want to take on interest rates. And that might signal that there is some thinking, some level of financial education that explained why they switch to debit rather than credit. But when it comes to the use of cards for money transfers, basically there is a very, very small number of people who really rely on the different kinds of cards for sending money. It's really, again, a small percentage. So we looked at the entire number of applications, and basically we learned that there are these three different sets of groups. The ones that basically are not a user, that is about 25%. The basic user, that is 60%. And then the active user, that is 16%. And they share some characteristics. They are younger. They have been longer time in the United States. They send more money than others. They also are married or living with the spouse. To some extent, you can say there are people, the more active users are relatively more integrated in the US than the less active user. The question is, from a business point of view, what do I do with the 60% group that can either switch to being non-user or actually is my potential market to some extent? And even when we look at the 16% group, we realize that the majority are still using cash-to-cash services, that only 5% are using account to cash transfers either through the internet or through banks. So the market is relatively open to a large extent. We also looked at a number of internet-based companies and mobile transfer companies, and we actually tested some of these companies to see, do they offer an attractive alternative for the consumer if people were willing to switch, for example, into mobile. And we looked at these 5 companies, and we tested them on a number of things, on the functionality of the system, their usability, their formality, and their openness. Basically, we looked at issues like how easy it is to open an account and send money. How many steps does it take for people to send money using your mobile device? So we looked at Amazon, we looked at, what's this, Envia, we looked at PayPal. PayPal was very interesting, in fact, because it's very hard to actually use PayPal to send money. And the findings were very interesting. We were able to send money only with one company, with Envia, but Envia only sends to Mexico and to selected locations, and you can only send from California. So basically, anyone who could do it couldn't do it at that point. Obviously, the company can tell you that they will expand and they will grow. You know the speech. But the interesting thing for us was that it was still a work in progress, that it's still a cumbersome process. The findings are similar to those that we did with the use of debit cards 5 years ago, when it was really cumbersome. There were at least 10 steps to get a card to send money. And at the end of the day, the transaction cost was relatively expensive than more expensive than sending money through your typical cash-to-cash agent-based model. Nowadays, they are a little bit less expensive. The cards are less expensive than cash to cash, but the outreach and the marketing to that to the consumer base is yet to happen. So we see basically some sort of a trend to some extent with different dynamics taking place in various directions. People who want to switch but really don't have the techno-savviness, either because of education or because of resources, but they want to switch. An industry that is trying to continue on the mainstream, on the agent-based model, but at the same time that there are other businesses that are entering with alternative technologies. So what is the outcome? What might be the outcome of this? My immediate reaction is that the demand side is going to move the supply side, particularly in the direction of using the accounts of immigrants, the bank accounts of immigrants, to send money. And the money transfer companies basically will have to consider how they can use their accounts to send money. That may need to reconsider the agent-based model, not by eliminating it necessarily, but by offering different incentives for the agents to send money through a bank account. May also mean that people will be able to switch to the mechanism of mobile transfers, for example. In some contexts, the mobile might be an easy thing to do for people who have bank accounts and may find it easy to go to an agent to load money. So to some extent, we are at some sort of a juncture in terms of where is the industry going in relationship to these new technologies, that there are significant limitations taking place, but willingness to switch. And so what do you do when you want to change, but you don't have all the resources available? You start with the very basic things. And at this point, the most basic things are those that relate to the account itself. Your bank account as basically an origination of payment. And so one can think of different strategies, push and pull approaches, push strategies to push people into the market and in ways that they can feel more attractive to different methodologies, and pull strategies also that bring them into the system. Pushing, for example, by changing the agent-based relationship by offering different incentives to people, and pull can be, for example, the offer of the direct deposit attached to mobile transfers, for example. Understanding the financial preferences of immigrants, or using the existing clients, the active clients, as your marketing people themselves. I think definitely the dynamics that are taking place at this point are showing that people will want to move out of the current system, and that they have slowly going in that direction in the last few years. But at the same time, the way in which this is going to happen is not going to be in a revolutionary way, that people will basically change completely and go mobile. In the United States in particular, the adoption of mobile technology seems attractive, but is also in competition as a device with at least 6 or 7 different systems for transactional activities. So it's not that convenient for most people. And the question is, can these systems add convenience to people? Will the internet add convenience to immigrants, for example, for sending money in the context whereby only 40% use the internet and only a very small percent actually use it for some activities?